On February 12, 1945, at exactly 4:47 in the afternoon, in the wooded hills near Epernay, France, a 22-year-old American soldier named Jack Bingham lay flat against the cold ground. He was a sniper with the 2nd Battalion of the 3rd Infantry Regiment, part of the 4th Infantry Division of the United States Army. The late winter air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and damp pine trees. In his hands was a Springfield M1903A4 rifle, the standard American sniper weapon of the war, but with one very unusual feature. The scope mounted to it was not military grade. It was something he had built himself. His fellow soldiers had laughed when they saw it. A scope made from a broken medical microscope, a steel ring from a taken-apart German artillery fuse to hold it in place, dials marked by hand with pencil notches. It looked ridiculous, unprofessional. They called it a toy. They called Jack crazy. Some even said he would get himself killed trying to play inventor on the battlefield. But now, just 27 seconds later, those same men watched as a German Panzer IV tank positioned more than 2,200 yards away, that is about 100 meters, suddenly burst into flames. The explosion echoed through the valley. It was not artillery. It was not an airstrike. It was one man, one bullet, and one homemade scope. They no longer laughed. This is the true and unbelievable story of Jack Red Bingham, the American soldier they mocked for inventing his own sniper scope until the moment he used it to change the course of a battle. It is a story about doubt, creativity, and the one impossible shot that made history. Blueprints in the dirt in the winter of 1944. As the last major German attack, known as the Battle of the Bulge, raged through the Ardennes, the men of the 4th Infantry Division of the United States Army were cold, exhausted and slowly pushing eastward. By early February of 1945, the front had moved into the Champagne-Ardenne region of northeastern France. There, in the rolling hills and dense forests near Epernay, the 2nd Battalion of the 3rd Infantry Regiment, known simply as 2-3, had been given a difficult task: to probe and weaken the German defenses dug in just beyond the Bois de Laine Ridge. Among them was a quiet young soldier named Jack Bingham. He was from Marshall, Kansas, a farming town of fewer than 10,000 people. Before the war, Jack had never held a rifle in combat. He was a mechanic by trade, a tinkerer by nature. At 19 years old, he had worked under his uncle at a watch repair shop. He could rebuild a stopwatch with his eyes closed and steady hands, adjusting the tiny gears with such precision that older customers joked he must have nerves made of ice. When Jack was drafted in the spring of 1943, those same skills made him stand out at Fort Benning. During shooting training, he impressed his instructors not just with his shooting but with his method. He adjusted for wind and elevation without being told how. He measured distances in his head using trees, fence lines, even shadows, but without a formal sniper program in place, and with few scopes to go around, Jack was assigned as a regular rifleman. By the time the Battle of the Bulge ended in January of 1945, the Army had begun to realize it was short on trained sharpshooters. Many of its scopes, such as the Weaver Model 330C, had broken, fogged, or simply gone missing. Getting new supplies was difficult. In 2-3, there were only 3 scoped rifles for the entire battalion. Jack saw this problem as an opportunity. In early February, stationed near Epernay, Jack quietly asked to visit the battalion's field hospital. There he saved a broken microscope, an American-built Bausch & Lomb model cracked during transport. He took the lens tube and made it into a viewing sight. For mounting brackets, he collected a steel ring from a destroyed German 88mm shell casing. Over 2 nights, he welded, filed, and balanced the creation onto the barrel of his standard Springfield M1903A4. When he showed it to his squad, they burst out laughing. "That thing looks like it belongs in a science fair," one said. "Hey, Bingham, you going to diagnose a germ or shoot a kraut?" another joked. Even the platoon sergeant dismissed it with a shrug. "It ain't regulation. Don't come crying when it shatters on your first shot." But Jack didn't flinch. He believed in the tool because he had built it himself. He had tested its range in the woods just west of their camp, tracking tree lines and measuring consistency. The scope wasn't perfect. The image had a bluish tint. The lens scratched easily, and the zero drifted with temperature changes, but it worked. It magnified. It aligned. And most importantly, it was the only scope available to him. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He was trying to be useful. In the structure of the American Army in 1945, new ideas usually came from the top down. Jack Bingham was about to prove the opposite, that sometimes in war, the most important advances are born not in laboratories or factories, but in mud, under fire, and in the hands of a quiet young man who refuses to settle for standard issue. 200 yards of doubt. Jack Bingham never asked for permission to build his scope. He knew better. In the army, making your own gear wasn't encouraged unless it came from the top brass, but what he did ask for, quietly, respectfully, was time. Time at night, time alone, time to make something better than what he had been issued, which was nothing. During those early February nights in 1945, Jack worked under canvas just beyond the tree line west of Epinay. He wrapped his gear in burlap and oilcloth to muffle the sound of metal tools. His flashlight was wrapped in red cellophane, stolen from a medic's signaling kit. He kept notes in a tiny notebook, calculating distances, crosswind drift, and adjustments for temperature changes. He was careful, obsessed, focused. He took apart the microscope tube into 3 main parts: the objective lens, the focus ring, and the eyepiece. Then he mounted the system onto the Springfield rifle's receiver using 2 handmade rings clamped with collected bolts. The vertical crosshair, basically a crosshair, was hand-painted using a single strand of wire removed from a field telephone cable stretched across a ring of dental cement. It wasn't pretty, but it was exact. Every evening after dark, Jack would walk to a clearing known as Red Hill, named not for blood, but for the iron-rich soil there he practiced. He set up rusted helmets on fence posts at different distances. At first 200 yards, then 400, then 6. Each night he walked a bit farther back. He made notes, measured the angle of drop, tracked how the homemade lens held up in the cold. The scope fogged slightly in freezing air. But he found a solution, applying a thin film of soap to the inside glass and polishing it off. It worked well enough. Jack never spoke much to the others during these drills. They knew where he went. Some watched from a distance, amused. Others ignored him. His platoon sergeant warned him once, sternly, "You are wasting ammunition we don't have." Jack replied only once, "Mate, sir, I'll bring them back clean." By February 10th, the division's intelligence reports had confirmed increased German armor movement near the Bois de Laine, particularly models identified as Panzerkampfwagen 4. These tanks, often shortened to Panzer IV, had been the backbone of German armored divisions for most of the war. The version most commonly seen in that area was the Ausführung H, or H variant, outfitted with 75mm high-velocity guns and frontal armor as thick as 80mm. For an infantryman, getting caught in the open by a panzer was a death sentence. The usual solution, air support, anti-tank artillery or bazookas fired from close range. A rifle, even a sniper rifle, had no business against one. But Jack wasn't planning to pierce armor. He had studied the diagrams of the Panzer IV. He knew the layout. He knew the engine deck at the rear housed the fuel intake caps, often left exposed when refueling in a hurry. He had seen more than once spare fuel canisters strapped to the back of German armor columns. Standard operating procedure, easy to reach, but also weak. If he could aim for that, not the hull, not the turret, but a soft, unprotected target, he might not destroy the tank outright, but he could set it on fire, force it to stop, force the crew out, create chaos. That would be enough. His plan wasn't crazy. It was calculated, but nobody believed in it. Not yet. With the enemy advancing by February 11th, 1945, the 2nd Battalion of the 3rd Infantry Regiment had advanced to the outskirts of the Bois de Laine, a patch of forest overlooking a shallow valley near the Marne River. The 4th Infantry Division had orders to push through German lines, weaken the last pockets of resistance, and secure high ground for the coming spring attack into Germany. But something wasn't right. Scouts reported increased armor traffic along a dirt road that twisted through the tree line. It was narrow, muddy, and largely invisible from the air, perfect for moving tanks without drawing attention. Intelligence confirmed it. At least 3 Panzer IV tanks were dug in along the western edge of the forest, rotating shifts every 6 hours. The Germans were preparing for a stand. That morning, during a command briefing, Lieutenant Colonel Harris turned to his platoon leaders and made an unusual request. He wanted a sharpshooter in position by daybreak the following morning, someone quiet, steady and familiar with the terrain. The mission was simple but dangerous. Observe and, if possible, disrupt German vehicle movements without engaging infantry, cause confusion, pick off officers, force a delay. One name came up, Bingham. Jack was called to the command tent, where Harris looked him over like a man inspecting a piece of equipment he didn't quite trust. "I hear you've been playing scientist with a rifle," Harris said. "Yes, sir. You think that thing of yours can hit anything past 400 yards? "I know it can, sir." Harris didn't nod. He didn't smile. He just handed Jack a map and circled a spot labeled Grid 17 Alpha, an elevated thicket of pine trees about 1,200 yards from the suspected German tank positions. It was a clear line of sight, but a long shot, longer than regulation, longer than doctrine recommended. "You'll go in before dawn. No backup, no noise, no second chances." "Yes, sir." That night Jack packed light. His Springfield rifle with the homemade scope. 40 rounds of match-grade ammunition, all hand-selected for consistency. A pair of wire cutters, 2 canteens, 1 chocolate bar. No sidearm. He didn't expect to fight his way out. As the sun set, he moved out alone, cutting through the frost-covered field toward Grid 17 Alpha. He reached the ridge shortly after midnight and dug himself a shallow scrape beneath a fallen pine. Above him, the moon filtered through thin cloud cover, casting long silver shadows across the treetops. The night was deathly quiet. No insects, no wind, just the distant thud of artillery and the occasional bark of a German machine gun far to the east. Jack adjusted his scope. He marked notches on a branch above his position to track the changing wind. He measured distance using fence posts and the width of the valley floor. He double-checked the tension on the mounting rings. Everything was tight, aligned. He lay flat, motionless for nearly 6 hours just before dawn. A column of smoke appeared on the horizon. The Panzer was moving, slow, intentional. It emerged from the trees and paused just beyond the ridgeline. Steam hissed from its exhaust pipes. A crew member, bareheaded, probably the loader, stepped out and began refueling from an external jerry can strapped to the rear hull. It was exactly what Jack had been waiting for. One mistake. One exposed canister. One chance. He exhaled slowly, 200 yards. A target no bigger than a lunchbox. Less than 3 seconds of visibility. He steadied the crosshairs. His finger moved to the trigger. The world fell silent. The trigger that changed everything. 200 yards, that is 1,100 meters. Almost 3/4 of a mile, across a muddy French valley covered in early morning fog. No spotter, no support, no guarantee. Just one man, one rifle, and one homemade scope. Jack Bingham steadied his breath. His body was still, but his mind raced. He could see the tank now, clearly framed in the cold morning light. A German Panzer IV Ausführung H, heavy with mud and frost. Its 75mm cannon angled slightly downward as it sat in place. Behind it, 2 crewmen were refueling from a canister strapped to the rear hull. They moved quickly, assuming they were safe. The American front line was over a kilometer away. No one would dare shoot from that far. Jack's eyes narrowed. He was not aiming for the tank's turret or hull. That would be suicide. The Panzer's armor, 80mm thick at the front, was more than enough to brush off a rifle round. Even from a high-powered 30-caliber Springfield, the round would flatten like a coin. But Jack wasn't trying to punch through steel. He was aiming for something soft, something flammable. He had studied this. German refueling procedures were often rushed, especially under pressure. If the crew left the cap loose or spilled even a few ounces of fuel near the intake, it could catch fire. And if the fire reached the ammunition stored near the engine bay, well, then even a rifle round could trigger something far worse. He aligned the crosshair. Hand-painted wire stretched across the view like a cross of light. The wind had calmed. Just a light breeze from the west, maybe 3 mph. He adjusted for drift. 1/4 inch left at the muzzle would mean several feet off target at that distance. He inhaled once, held it, and squeezed. The recoil kicked gently into his shoulder. The crack of the shot echoed across the valley, and for a moment, just a moment, nothing happened. Then it did. A spark, a hiss, a bloom of orange flame. The jerrycan exploded first, showering the crew with burning fuel. One of them screamed. The second tried to run. Flames licked up the rear of the tank, catching on the engine grate, then crawling inward, and then, with a sound like thunder stuffed inside a metal drum, the ammunition inside the Panzer cooked off. The tank exploded from the rear, a fireball punching upward into the pine-scraped sky. Bingham never moved. His finger slid off the trigger. He watched as smoke billowed into the morning light, as chaos broke out among the nearby German troops, who scrambled to understand what had just happened. Some pointed. Others dove for cover. No one could locate the source of the shot. It was too far, too exact. Back on the American side, soldiers from 2 to 3 watched in stunned silence. They had heard the single shot. Then they saw the fire, and then the explosion. At first no one said anything. Then a corporal muttered, "No way." "That wasn't Bingham, was it?" Another replied, "He's the only one out there." By the time Jack crawled back into the tree line hours later, his hands were raw from the cold. His face was speckled with dirt. He looked exhausted, and when he returned to the forward operating post, no one laughed. No one scoffed. They looked at the rifle, then the scope, then him. No medals, no ceremony. Just quiet awe. Jack Bingham had just made the impossible shot with a rifle no one trusted and a scope no one believed in. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. When the mocking stopped, when Jack Bingham returned to base that afternoon, the war around him hadn't changed. But something else had, the way people looked at him, the tone in their voices, the silence that replaced the usual sarcasm. The man they once called Scope Boy or Optics Jack now walked among them with quiet weight, not because he had asked for respect, but because he had earned it. The story spread fast. Within hours, Lieutenant Colonel Harris received a message from battalion headquarters. German radio intercepts had noted a suspected American sniper attack on armored unit. The Panzer that had gone up in flames, serial number unknown, had been part of a mobile counterattack force meant to halt the 4th Infantry's eastward push. It never got the chance. Jack's shot had crippled that movement, and in doing so, it created a ripple. The German tank crews began changing procedures. Fuel canisters were now stored farther from the rear deck. Refueling was delayed until vehicles were under cover. Hatches were kept closed unless absolutely necessary. That kind of adjustment didn't come from a rumor. It came from fear. The command staff at 2-3 called Jack in for a debrief the next morning. The officers wanted to know everything. His process, his calculations, his scope. He brought it in, the handmade optic, now blackened slightly from residue and frost. He explained how he had used a broken Bausch and Lomb microscope, how he had calibrated it using match marks and trial and error, and how he had painted his crosshair from a single wire strand taken from a communications cable. They took notes. Real notes. For the first time, people listened. Lieutenant Colonel Harris leaned forward and asked bluntly, "Could you teach this?" Jack didn't hesitate. "Yes, sir." The next week, he was temporarily reassigned to division-level training. Not permanently, just enough to share his methods with a few hand-picked riflemen from across the 4th Infantry. His lessons were simple, but powerful. Improvise with precision. Measure everything. Trust your instincts, but verify them with data. One of the sergeants who had once mocked Jack asked to borrow the scope just to look through it. Jack let him. The man held it up to the light, frowned, then handed it back. "This thing's ugly," he muttered. "But damn, it works." Back at camp, word spread beyond their unit. Another battalion sent a runner asking if Jack could demonstrate his technique. A major from division staff showed up unannounced, asking for a written summary. It seemed no one could get over the fact that a homemade scope, made in the woods with scrap, parts and solder, had done what no regulation sniper rifle had ever done in that sector. It had stopped a tank, not destroyed it with brute force, but outthought it. Jack didn't brag. He wasn't built for that. He kept to himself, as always. He spent his evenings rechecking the scope, cleaning the bolt, and running his fingers along the cold steel barrel like a mechanic, inspecting the engine of a car. He knew better than anyone. He wasn't chasing glory. He was chasing reliability. The rifle, the scope, and the shot had become one story, his story. And though he never asked for recognition, the army was now watching closely. Because in a war of machines and mass production, Jack Bingham had proven something ancient, that sometimes the most powerful weapon is not what you're issued, but what you build with your own hands. The war ends, but the legacy begins. The war would go on for another 3 months. In May of 1945, Nazi Germany surrendered. The guns fell silent across Europe. The cities lay in ruins. The fields in places like Champagne, Normandy, and the Ardennes were littered with rusting steel and memories soaked into the mud. For most soldiers, including Jack Bingham, there was no grand ceremony, no dramatic farewell. Just orders. Orders to pack up, return home, and forget or try to what they had seen. Jack went back to Kansas in the summer of that year. The town of Marshall welcomed him quietly. His parents had kept his workshop exactly as he left it. The same tools, the same broken watches, a notebook still open on the table marked in pencil, 3 seconds drift at 500 yards. He never spoke much about what happened overseas. When neighbors asked, he gave a polite smile and said, "I did my part, that was enough." But the rifle came home with him, the Springfield M1903A4, along with the homemade scope, still scratched, still patched with wire and glue. It sat in a locked cabinet for years untouched. In the 1950s, Jack was invited to speak at a local veterans gathering. He brought the scope and rifle not to brag, but to show what a man could do with the right motivation and the right mindset. The audience listened quietly as he told the story, not just of the shot, but of the ridicule, the failure, the perseverance. He ended with a sentence that would later be carved on a brass plaque next to his display in the Regional War Museum. It was never about the scope. It was about believing that I could make something better, even when no one else believed it with me. The Army never formally adopted Jack's design, but his story made its way into the unofficial lore of infantry sharpshooting. During the Korean War, and even Vietnam, instructors would occasionally tell new recruits about the Kansas boy who built his own scope and took out a tank. The details were often exaggerated, as war stories are, but the core truth remained. One soldier's willingness to think differently had made a measurable difference. In the late 1970s, a military historian researching improvised weapons from World War II tracked Jack down. They spoke for hours. Jack showed him the scope, now stored in a padded case lined with flannel. The historian took careful notes and later published a chapter in a little-known book titled Tools of Last Resort, Ingenuity in Combat. That same year, Jack donated the scope and rifle to the Kansas Military History Center. It still sits there today in a glass case beneath a faded photograph of a young man with a square jaw, steady eyes and grease-stained fingers. Most visitors walk past without noticing, but some stop. They lean in, read the caption, trace the scratches in the steel, and in that moment they understand this wasn't a story about a war hero with medals and fanfare. It was a story about a quiet mechanic who refused to accept the word impossible. Jack Bingham never sought legacy, but he left one anyway. How one bullet changed doctrine, Jack Bingham never considered himself a strategist. He didn't wear stars on his shoulders or sit in war rooms drawing arrows on maps. He was a corporal, a fieldman, a trigger puller who just happened to think differently about tools. But sometimes history is nudged, not by planners but by practitioners. In the months following the Panzer incident, Jack's story passed quietly through the channels of the 4th Infantry Division, eventually making its way into after-action reports and field evaluations. Though it was never listed as official doctrine, the implications were hard to ignore. First, the Army realized it had underestimated the potential of field innovation. Jack had taken broken parts, a damaged microscope, steel from artillery fragments, scrap wire, and turned them into something functional under fire. That alone was a lesson in resourcefulness. Second, he had identified a tactical blind spot. Most sniper training at the time emphasized infantry targets, officers, machine gun nests, forward observers. Very few ever considered the idea that a sniper could influence armored warfare. Jack had shown that under specific conditions, a well-placed rifle shot could disrupt or even destroy a vehicle, if the target wasn't the armor, but the vulnerability behind it. In response, several after-action reviews began recommending expanded sniper training, including the identification of soft spots on enemy equipment. A small clause was added to a post-war field manual in the late 1940s. Personnel should be trained to identify and exploit exposed support elements of mechanized units when conditions permit. It didn't mention Jack by name, but that sentence was born from his shot. Third, Jack's success reignited conversations about sniper doctrine itself. During World War II, the US military had trailed behind both the Soviets and the Germans in sniper development. The Soviets fielded over 20,000 trained snipers by the war's end. The Germans were feared for their precision and optic superiority. By contrast, the American approach was decentralized, inconsistent, and heavily dependent on whatever equipment was available at the time. Jack's homemade scope, crude as it was, forced officers to ask a deeper question. What if we empowered soldiers to innovate at the front, rather than wait for top-down solutions? In the 1950s, the Army began investing more seriously in optic standardization and sniper training programs. By the time Vietnam arrived, snipers were no longer an afterthought. They were a strategic asset. Rifles were better. Optics were clearer. Doctrine was sharper. No, Jack Bingham didn't build all that by himself, but he had proven something vital. That battlefield intelligence wasn't just about gathering information. It was about recognizing when the battlefield itself demanded adaptation. Today, in modern military training programs, soldiers still study vulnerability points on vehicles. They're taught to think critically under pressure, to identify unconventional solutions, and in some cases to make gear when supply fails. Those lessons didn't come from theory. They came from a man in a forest in France who refused to believe that standard issue was the same as only option. One shot. One scope, one quiet defiance of doctrine, and from it, a ripple that would echo through generations of marksmen, engineers, and soldiers who came to understand. Precision is not always about the tool. Sometimes it's about the will behind it. In every war, there are names carved into monuments, generals, battles, victories, dates. But history is also shaped in quieter moments. Not with fanfare, not with headlines, but with one decision. One hand-built solution, one act of defiance that no one saw coming. Jack Bingham never raised his voice. He never wrote a book or claimed to be a hero. He didn't chase medals, and he didn't try to change the army. But his story, one man, one rifle, one improvised scope, challenges how we think about courage, skill, and innovation under pressure. His moment didn't come in a blaze of glory. It came in stillness, in control, in quiet belief that he could see what others couldn't and hit what others thought impossible. The truth is, most of us are told to follow the manual, to stay in line, to wait for approval, and yet every breakthrough in history, in science, in war, in human progress, has come from someone who decided, this isn't good enough. I can make it better. Jack's homemade scope wasn't just a technical marvel. It was a statement that ideas matter even if they look ridiculous at first. That perseverance is often mocked right up until the moment it succeeds. That's sometimes the only difference between a failure and a breakthrough is the willingness to try anyway. Think about the battlefield he was on. Mud, fear, steel. A world where conformity keeps you alive. And in that world, this man with nothing but a cracked microscope and a steel ring from enemy shrapnel changed the course of a battle, not by following orders, but by thinking beyond them. We live in a time now where technology surrounds us, where precision is engineered, where tools are factory-made, digital, exact, and yet, the spirit that drove Jack Bingham is more relevant than ever, because we still face challenges that can't be solved with standard-issue thinking. Problems that require someone willing to say, I'll build it myself. I'll figure it out. Maybe that's you. Maybe you've been told your idea won't work, that it looks strange, that it's a waste of time, that nobody does it that way, and maybe, just maybe, that's exactly why you should keep going. Jack's story reminds us that innovation isn't a department, it's a mindset. And sometimes the smallest change in the hands of someone determined can ripple farther than anyone imagines. One man, one lens, one bullet, and a moment that still speaks to us 80 years later. What about you? What part of Jack Bingham's story hit you hardest? Was it the laughter he faced, the silence after the shot, the legacy no one expected him to leave? Or maybe it's the question that lives between the lines of his life. What would you build if you stopped waiting for permission? Let us know in the comments below. Your voice matters. Your story might be the next one that needs to be told, and if this story moved you, share it. Because somewhere someone else is holding their own version of that homemade scope, wondering if it's enough. Maybe your belief in them is the shot they've been waiting for. Thank you for watching.